Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. And today, we're talking about
the big topic of free speech, but we're going to put a different spin on it. Instead of talking so much about rights, we're going to try to reframe it in terms of responsibilities.
the consequences of one's actions, even though you have a right to do them, does not remove the consequences of them.
Yeah, and we could talk about how to be a good speaker in the sense of being somebody who actually deserves to be heard. You know, I think there's a lot of people in the free speech discussions that want to insist on, I have to have a platform, I have to be heard, and they talk all the time about their right, and that's important. But a lot of the stuff that gets said under the rubric of free speech isn't particularly worth saying or hearing, or it's just mean-spirited or in bad faith. And so I think it makes sense for us, at least at one point in time, and maybe this is that point in time, to focus instead a little bit more on being a responsible speaker, meaning somebody who is accountable, not just in the sense of like people, booing you or yaying you, but something that involves more of the person in the speech that we use. And so I think this is, personally, I think this is an important topic and quite overlooked.
I guess it's not quite one-to-one, but kind of the idea of, being a responsible driver, and that you have a...
Yeah.
It's not quite a right, but you have the privilege of driving, but there's certain expectations while you do this. Maybe, if we go to, was it Life, Liberty, and Property for John Locke, that just because you have life doesn't mean that you have the ability to do anything with your life. There are certain other rights that people outside of you have that you can infringe upon.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a libertarian perspective that says that what matters most are rights, and that, your rights end where another person's rights begin. And we'll talk about them. They often tend to be kind of thin in terms of how they conceive of the social fabric. I would go further. Actually, I'll bring up two things. So Thomas Hobbes, who, Locke and all the other people who take after him use as sort of a nemesis, you could say. Even Thomas Hobbes, in talking about what's required within the social contract, he says one of the laws of nature is that everybody basically adapt themselves to everybody else. And he uses the metaphor of how a stone that doesn't fit into the fence because it's got the wrong sort of corners, it's going to get thrown out, And I think that this is something that often gets left out when we're talking about speech. Maybe because if I go to your house and I I'm doing something that's destructive to your property, it's really easy to tell. But when we're transgressing certain norms when it comes to how we use speech, even though we can do it, there's a lot of cases where we probably shouldn't do it. And I do want to say too that I don't want to frame this just in terms of thou shalt not, in terms of negative norms, and say, well, we should restrict free speech a lot more. I want to talk about what would be positive in being a good speaker, in being the kind of speaker who engages with other people in positive ways.
Yeah, we are at base a very social species, and thus there are lots of benefits that we have derived from being able to work within and with the group in order to achieve ends. And if you can't speak well and get people, I guess, on your side, if that's the best way to frame that, then you're not going to actually achieve your ends. And so this might be a utilitarian argument of like, what do you actually want to do?
Yeah, I would say you could also have bad ends, of course, right? So we could say, let's all do hate speech against so-and-so, and we coordinate together and bully somebody. So not all ends are necessarily good ends just by being ends. But you're right. You know, Augustine points this out. You need some sort of what he calls concord or peace, even in a band of robbers. They can't all be just doing their own thing and robbing each other. They have to have some sort of coordination. And if we want a better life, if we want something that goes just beyond, you know, looking at each other from across our walls, armed to the teeth in a Hobbesian way or something along those lines, if we want a true human life together, we have to be able to communicate in ways that allow us to connect as persons, to express who we are, what we're interested in, what we value. And there does have to be, you know, a capacity for saying, no, I think you've got things wrong. But disagreement doesn't always have to be done in you know, such in-your-face, devil's advocate kind of jerkish ways that the people who are often defending free speech see some almost like value in. They seem to think that either, you know, we have to tolerate this sort of thing because it's important for some reason or another, and we'll get into some of those ideas, like with a marketplace of ideas and those sort of tropes, or they're like, listen, it's my rights, and I get to express myself no matter how noxious and, you know, poorly formed my sentiments or conscience or whatever it happens to be are. So I think we want to think about where we want to move towards, what kind of things we want to emulate, what kind of people we want to promote, rather than just saying, well, so long as you don't break the law, so long as you don't violate these really, you know, thin norms, you're A-okay.
Kind of like reminds me of, I don't know, half of the episodes of Seinfeld, which are someone commits some sort of social faux pas, and so that sets off a you know, Rube Goldberg series of events that results in, you know, the nothing that show is about.
Yeah, and Curb Your Enthusiasm is just sort of a follow-up of that, right? And maybe an intensification of that.
Yeah.
And they have conflicts, too, about whether a norm exists, whether it's been violated, whose fault it is. They get into all of these really extensive discussions about those sorts of things.
And some of the thing earlier talking about remind me of the, you know, access and who gets access, and
yeah, that's a very important point.
You know, just by dint of their who they are, their background, their you know, wealth, their, you know, reputation, or just like maybe even more basic, like how they look, they dress.
Yeah.
A lot of times will prevent them from even being taken seriously at the very onset. And if you are automatically dissing someone's or discarding someone's opinion based on those things, then there's also a lack of speech and the reciprocity that is expected in that.
Yeah, and you can say on the flip side that something similar also happens, where some people, just by virtue of, you know, whose kids they are, or being, you know, particularly good looking, or saying the right thing at the right time to appeal to a broad audience, or, you know, we could go down the line, they get to talk and everyone else basically gets pushed out. You know, this is not something that we like prepared in the show notes, but there's talk about like an attention economy, right? Just like there's a monetary economy and all sorts of other economies. And I think that's quite true. There's only so much room on the stage, and there's only so much time. You know, if you think about this show, the more we talk about one thing, the less we can talk about another thing. So we're always, as let's call it, consumers of attention, making some decisions about who's worth watching and who's not worth watching or listening to, or who gets to speak. And you know, quite often the decisions that are made about that are quite arbitrary and unfair, I would say.
not to mention, like the old adage, it bleeds, it leads. The idea that negative things and things that are potentially fearful are one of our really big biases. And I think we spoke about it a couple weeks ago, talking about I can't remember exactly the author of the study. The conclusion of the study was that on average we're about 4 times more aware of negative things than we are positive things. And so it holds our attention, as well as it remains within our ability to recollect significantly longer. And so if you are just out there to try to push that mental trigger of our biases that are just built into the way that we perceive the world,
or exploit some issue that's arisen that's controversial and say, hey, those people over there are terrible, let's focus on that, right?
Yeah, and so it swallows up. It's like a black hole of attention, whereas there could be a lot when we're talking about rational debate, that's rather benign. But if you have a riot or something, and everyone's like, yes, and ignore the thing that's happening over here.
Something like that was happening. I don't think a lot of people actually watch TV news anymore at given times of the night, but I remember back when we used to do that, the bigger city you were in, the more it would be dominated by crime stories, because obviously there was more crime. So like in a city like Chicago, there could be a murder or a shooting each day. And then people would get the idea that, it's so much more unsafe here than it is in Appleton, Wisconsin. And Appleton could be, depending on when we're talking about it, might be more dangerous than Chicago, less dangerous than Chicago. You can look at the stats for that sort of thing. But because the TV news cycle worked the way that it would, you would get a lot more of that, and that would draw your attention.
And also, Chicago has a lot more news stations than Appleton does, and so if you want to compete and draw the viewers,
well, there's that too. Yeah. We could talk. I mean, we could actually do a whole show on the attention economy sometime, perhaps. But let's come back.
So maybe let's go back to speech.
Yeah. So I think that typically, and I might be wrong about this, so it's not like I've done some sort of scientific survey of this, but I think that most of the time that people are talking about freedom of speech, they're framing it in one of 2 main ways, or they're framing it in another way that's even less productive. So one of the really common ways is to frame it in terms of rights and rules, to say, okay, there are certain rules, you can't cross these, and anything else, it's your right, you can say whatever you like. And then, that's not going to work for reasons that we'll talk about. It leads to all sorts of crazy paradoxes and leads to conflicts. But the other way that John Stuart Mill is probably the most famous proponent of is to say that there's a kind of social utility. There's a usefulness, a greater benefits over harms in allowing as much freedom of speech as possible and not censoring or punishing, or however you want to frame it. So there's sort of like a deontological approach that's focused on rights and rules, and then there's a utilitarian approach that says, well, people might say really terrible things, but overall it works out to everybody's benefit if we allow this sort of thing, even though it can be, hurtful to some people. And then,
I would say in extension to Mill, on Liberty, he is defending the freedom of thought of discussion, but it is in the collective pursuit of truth. It's not freedom of thought and discussion for its own sake, but it has to have some, ends of the pursuit of truth.
Yeah, and that's something that I think a lot of free speech advocates sometimes they give lip service to that. They're like, well, marketplace of ideas, it's going to work out better for all of us. And then they say horrible things. And you're like, I'm not sure that's really advancing the discussion here, or you could say well, how many times do you have to spout Nazi propaganda for us to actually have gotten the message that maybe this is one thing we need to engage with, the use of Mill is quite often itself disingenuous, I would say.
Right.
I would say as well. Saying,
go ahead. I said you were saying.
I think that in addition to these two more principled approaches, there's also some people who are just quite selfish about it, and they invoke freedom of speech just so they can do whatever they want to, or say whatever they want to, rather. So, we could call that just sort of a plain egoist approach to it. And, these are usually the bad actors in it. And I do want to say one thing, though. A person could be a bad actor at one point in time, and then maybe they get older and they start realizing that the way that they're doing things is hurting people, and they change their views about it and try to make amends. And so we don't want to like condemn somebody once and for all for their terrible uses of freedom of speech, especially when they're younger. But we do have to hold people accountable, and I think this is where the paradoxes start to arise, because people who say, freedom of speech means I get to say whatever I want, they often don't want to accept the consequences that come with it, which means everybody else gets to say whatever they want, which could include, hey buddy, you're a jerk and we don't want to spend time with you.
Right.
Suddenly then, you're not respecting my freedom of speech, you're censoring me. But that's equally freedom of speech, bro? Right? What were you saying?
Yeah. You mad, bro?
Yeah. That's probably one of the most common techniques I've actually seen too, like in YouTube comments and Twitter feuds and stuff like that, is to accuse the other person of being emotional and responding, say in anger, right? You're only, you're being mean to me. You're condemning my speech act because it hit some button. Usually you can throw in like calling somebody a snowflake or some other slogan about facts and feelings. But really one is typically, cross some sort of line. And even if somebody is angry, it doesn't matter if they're rightly condemning what it is that you spouted out,
Right. Surprisingly, I had one of those experiences not too long ago, and it wasn't even online. So there wasn't that veil of ignorance or that veil of
anonymity.
Anonymity. Yeah.
What happened?
I don't need to go into too much, but it was just an argument of asserting that other people were emotional while
the other person was perfectly logical.
Yeah, at least significantly more even keeled than the other person that was making the assertion in the first place.
Okay.
So there's definitely a little bit of projection there.
Yeah, I mean that's so. Let's think about this in sort of free speech terms. I don't think that we want to like have some sort of universal norm where you can't point out to other people, hey, you're being emotional and that's affecting the conversation between us. And if you're going to talk to me in that way, maybe I won't talk to you right now. Maybe I'll wait till you calm down and we can approach this. We don't have to like buy into the pure logic, reason, fact sort of ideology that's out there that some people seem to have. And those are people who are never like in very close contact with any three of those things, even though they use
None of us are Spock.
Yeah, exactly. And we wouldn't want to be, But I think that it's a perfectly valid use of one's freedom of speech to say, I'm not going to talk with you. I mean, this is what Mill calls the social sanction. He thinks that maybe everybody should have the capacity to say what's on their mind, but then you can like turn your back on them if you want to. You don't have to engage with them. I think that a lot of people who insist on how important freedom of speech is, they're not just demanding the right to say something and say it once. They're demanding the right to say it over and over and over again. They're demanding acknowledgement and recognition from other people who don't agree with them. And they're trying to get something more than, let's say it like this, they're trying to get something more than they deserve on the face of it, under the rubric of free speech. I mean, what do you think about that idea? Does that conform to our experience, or am I off on this? Or
I feel like, yes, there's like an expectation that they should be able to say anything, without any consequences, and maintain good standing, a good reputation within the group, I guess, that you're in. And it's a lot easier for you to be in places in which reputation doesn't matter. If you can be in anonymous places, 4chan or Reddit or whatever, or even Twitter, if you want to be getting new handles all the time. That oh man, that like really aged me. Handles.
Yeah, I haven't heard anyone talk about a Twitter handle for quite a while. I'd forgotten about that.
breaker. There's definitely like that, once again, that social aspect, that if you're in a group and someone is constantly, like if you're in your friends group and one guy is constantly like breaking the social norms within that group, eventually he's just not going to get invited out anymore, because he's kind of abusing his position, and he's losing that reputation the entire time, and there's that loss there. If you have anonymity, then you can just keep on, poking buttons and slinging turds or wherever you need to go.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a good set of points. I think that, again, Mill calls this the social sanction. There's all sorts of ways of thinking about this. We could ask, well, is that a use of freedom of speech that just has to be respected just as much? So if I am on Twitter and somebody says something that's overtly racist, and I say, wow, you're saying something that's really awful, maybe we should boycott you, right? They call this cancel culture now, right? Am I transgressing? Am I going too far in doing that? Or is that a legitimate use of freedom of speech? I think that if we're going to like open up the gates and say, well, we're going to be very permissive, then you got to accept that just as much as somebody being quite offensive.
Yeah, I guess I would like to break down cancel culture, because there's definitely a portion of cancel culture that you could definitely call just a straight boycott. And then there is a little bit of that dog pile, which is not quite exactly a boycott in the traditional sense of the boycott. And I think that a
dog pile is just calling people bad stuff back to them, right? It doesn't have consequences outside of, say, Twitter. If you decide to get all your Twitter buddies to dogpile me, there aren't any. I mean, I feel bad, right? So you hurt my feelings and all that, but there aren't any real world consequences outside of that. You're not hurting my.
There are some, like, okay. I'm taking extreme cases, obviously. And so there was the woman, I believe she made some joke. I can't remember what the joke was.
Oh, the one who flew to Africa, racist. Right?
Yeah. And then lost her job at the time that she got off the plane.
In that case, though, I don't think you can say it's the dog pile that. Well, I don't know. I mean, the employer fires her,
made
right?
it more aware, that people that was aware, like, unless her employer was specifically watching her Twitter and like going like, well, should I be, looking at all of my employees and make sure that none of them ever say anything that like might be a little untoward.
Yeah.
And I guess it feels like sometimes the response is greater than the infraction originally done. It's like a miscarriage of justice.
Yes. Well, that's interesting. I would say that any sort of, if we want to call it justice, in the sense of people getting payback or getting remotely what they deserve, it's always going to be pretty crude, right? It's never right. When it's something like people piling in on Twitter or on, I don't know, Facebook or something else in social media. I don't think you're going to get an exact punishment fits the crime sort of thing going on. And we can also think too, like, so let's say somebody's been saying a whole bunch of egregious things over time. Should you like have exactly that number of tweets going at them saying, you're a jerk, and maybe being racist is more hurtful than just calling somebody out on their racism. Although from what a lot of racists say, it seems to be very painful to be called a racist.
Oh no!
Well, I think it's very painful.
Wilting lily here.
Yeah, it's probably more painful for people who don't deserve it than people who do deserve it. But people who do deserve it, quite visibly, get very upset when you call them out on it, or they say yes, I am, and they try to justify it. But here's the point.
There's also like go
ahead.
The difference between the idea being racist is really bad, and everyone seems to agree upon that. And then there's the idea that as long as I'm not overtly saying specifically racist things, and
dog whistling, right?
Yeah, or saying things that they might not explicitly know is racist, but is definitely racist, and someone calls them out on that, then they get really offended because they're like, I'm a good person, and you're saying that I do something that only a bad person says, instead of trying to kind of remove them from whatever the perception you are is I did an action, and my action doesn't always make me. I have the ability to learn from that action. And that seems to be one instance where people get really offended because they don't realize the damage they're doing.
Yeah, that is quite true. I mean, and I think you can generalize that about people engaging in anything that's transgressing some norm that they probably should know about but don't know about, right? Mm-hmm. So if I don't know, when I was a kid, and you might be able to relate to this too, there's a lot of debate about whether you should ever spank your kids. And the psychological data seems to be saying it's probably a bad idea to do that, But I grew up on a street where there were very few kids who weren't spanked at all. They just got timeouts or alternative punishments. And then there were a vast majority of us who did get spanked. And then there were kids who got beaten. And you could kind of tell the difference between... Some people would say, oh, it's all illegitimate use of force. But we would say, no, I mean, that over there is definitely illegitimate. This over here, I don't like it, but I kind of had it coming to me, and I learned my lesson, and I'm not going to do that anymore, And then there were some borderline cases, of course. And some of the people who were not using corporal punishment might be just as terrible and abusive, just in other ways, emotionally abusive, verbally abusive. Anyway, right. What was the point I was trying to make with this? We're
trying to find degrees.
Yeah, and so if we think about somebody now in the present who realizes that they shouldn't have spanked their kids, right? Mm-hmm. They might have been in a position where it's harder for them to grasp that back then. It was still, if it was wrong, it was wrong. Right? Mm-hmm. And so we can sort of retroactively read that. And that's why we feel things like remorse, and we grow as people, and we say, holy, I was doing this thing before and I shouldn't have been doing that, right? That's almost part of the maturation process, I think, for most of us. I know I've got plenty of stuff where I did, and said boneheaded things that I'm happy I don't do anymore.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. A number of things, especially things that would trigger my anger or whatnot, that I made sure not to do, and getting those out of my regular rotation of actions is a big boon to my overall well-being.
Yeah, that's
as well
quite
as
true.
That and the well-being of those people that I love and live with,
or even have to work with. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, anger in the workplace could be a big problem. I think you wanted to talk about the paradox of tolerance, right, as an issue in free speech. So why don't you lead us through that?
So Karl Popper in the early 20th century wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, and he's talking about this idea of the paradox of tolerance. And so it goes forth, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the intolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them. In this formation, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies, as long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion. Suppression would certainly be most unwise, but we should claim the right to suppress if necessary, even by force, for it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument, because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists and pistols. Thus, we should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right to not tolerate the intolerant.
Yeah, and so there is a kind of paradoxicality to this, right? Intolerance, tolerance, where do they begin? Where do they end? You're being intolerant to the intolerant. How are you possibly tolerant yourself? Yeah.
So, for example, like if you take a white supremacist that wants the destruction of a portion of the populace, if you are that portion of that populace, or if you care about any of that portion of the populace, then there's no way you can tolerate that idea that is calling for the death or maiming or any other
relocation or whatever. Yeah.
Grievous harm done to these people. That is an intolerant position that cannot be tolerated in general discourse.
Yeah, and I think that you could extend this. I mean, Popper has some pretty extreme stuff in mind, right? But I think you could extend this to people who just are not going to carry out argument in good faith. By the way that they behave, that they've got a position and they're only interested in advancing that position. Everything that they're saying is essentially propaganda or polemics, Mm-hmm. I don't think that you have to give them the same mouthpiece or podium as people who are in fact contributing to, if there really is a marketplace of ideas, those would be bad actors within the marketplace of ideas. They're trying to monopolize. It's the difference
between like an honest interlocutor and a sophist. And
it's not as if the honest interlocutor is going to be some sort of communicative saint, right? Where they never, ever, ever say something out of anger and go a little bit too far and call somebody a mean name or something like that, or cut them off or whatever. But I think we can say there's a spectrum, and maybe once you reach a certain point on the spectrum, somebody should make you sit down and shut up.
And so like the example I use from like recent history is Milo Yiannopoulos, who over and over again showed that he wasn't interested in actually having honest debate. He was just there to get people angry.
Yeah, to stir stuff up, right?
Yeah, and so there's no point after a while, because that was his entire shtick. There's no reason for you to even be talking to this person, because there's nothing that you're going to be gaining from this.
Let me give you a sort of a thought experiment having to do with these free speech issues, and see what you think of it. And I'd be interested, if people want to comment, what they have to think about it as well. So imagine that there's somebody who just always says the same thing. They've always got the same shtick, right? And you've heard it already before. Do you owe them letting them say the same thing one more time? Or is it okay for you to say, listen, buddy, I've already heard your thing. I've already rejected it. You don't get to take up more space in my head or time on my show or stuff like that. So there's that scenario. Now, what if you're talking with them, and let's say it is on a show, and you've got viewers who haven't seen this person before, but they're going to say the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, and it's something that's really obnoxious, and they're going to say it in the same obnoxious way, great example of a show that was kind of like that. Morton Downey Jr. that I grew up with when I was a kid. It was this late night show, and this guy would like bring on all these people to have arguments with each other, and he'd talk really mean to them as well. And eventually he got in trouble because he faked getting beaten up by Nazis, and so that was the end of his show. But he would bring people on knowing that exactly what they were going to say. That's why he brought them on. It was to try to get ratings. I kind of think that's the wrong thing to do in most debates. But what do you think about it? So you got the scenario of you're talking with this person and you know what they're going to say. Do you owe them another hearing of the same endless thing?
So the question is that the only thing they're going to say? Because it kind of like reminds me of that the Roman senator that like would talk about the sewers, and then it'd always end with death to the Carthaginians.
Yeah, Carthage must be destroyed. Yeah.
Yeah. You would talk about other things, but like that was his stick. You'd always like come back to it. Is it solely that, or are they talking about other things as well?
Well, that's a good question. So imagine that no matter what the conversation is, sooner or later they're going to bring it back to their as we call it hobby horse. This thing that they're obsessed with.
Okay, so I guess if I was just having a one-on-one or a small conversation with him, then eventually I wouldn't have the conversation because we've already had that conversation over and over, and I feel like there's nothing more to go about. But there's definitely a difference within if you're having a conversation or if you're having a debate in front of viewers.
Yeah.
And I think that there is, as long as they're not just trying to goad you, as I talked about in my previous example, but they are presenting an issue that is their hobby horse, that if you feel like that is a bad position, then you now have the ability and an opportunity to have a reasoned argument against that position, and now you are kind of counteracting his hobby horse to the audience, as long as you can provide a good argument against it.
Yeah, so there it's sort of like the marketplace of ideas, conception where the good arguments drive out the bad arguments. It only works if we actually do engage in conflict with each other, or debate, or however you want to frame it. So long as there's alternatives being provided. And that's more or less, I think, what Mill had in mind in thinking that we should not censor most ideas in their expression, but not even censor intemperate, as he called it, expressions of those ideas. People being jerks as they're enunciating them.
So you had an article here on our notes about agracia and parrhesia. Would you give us a little rundown of that? Yeah,
so there's this really nice piece in The Atlantic by Teresa Bajan, I think is how her name is pronounced. And what's very helpful about it is she says, listen, freedom of speech doesn't just mean one thing. As a matter of fact, in ancient Athens, they had two different words for it that denoted two different aspects of what we often blur together as freedom of speech. So they had isegoria, and isegoria comes from this word isos, which means same or equal, and then parrhesia. And parrhesia is, we do sometimes translate as frankness of speech. So you may see it in Greek texts talked about that way. So isegoria was an equal right to participate in public debate, meaning that it's sort of like when you go to a town hall, so long as you haven't managed to get yourself kicked out, if you want to go to the mic and ask a question, you can ask a question, right? They may not actually, you might not like the answer you get, but you at least get to say your piece. Parrhesia is being able to say what you want to, when you want to, and to whoever you want to. So those are two different things. And, in a way, parrhesia is, think of it as like trumping isegoria. And what she was pointing out, and here, I think this is quite helpful, is that sometimes some of the people talking about freedom of speech have in mind that everybody gets to actually express themselves. Sometimes they just mean everybody, or at least some people, get to say whatever they want to whoever they want. And
without consequence.
That's the other part that goes along with it, right? Yeah. Being able to Be a jerk if you want to verbally. And I think there's some real tensions here, because let's say I get up and I'm a person who can talk for a long time, right? People will sometimes have me in to give a talk, and they're like, hey, can you talk about this? And I'll be like, yeah, I can talk about that for half an hour, or an hour if you want me to. And, if I do that and I'm not being attentive to anybody else. Now, when I talk, I'm actually usually engaging with the audience and asking them questions and getting them, involved, because I like to do that. But man, some people will just talk at you. I mean, we've had some university lectures like that, right? I don't know. Maybe you didn't when you were a student, but I had some who would just talk, never like, asked a question or engaged us in discussion. Well, that's not fair, right? That's them getting to have freedom of speech, and that's freedom for all the rest of us just to sit and listen and not get to participate. And so isegoria would say, no, everybody has to have a chance to talk if they want to. And so if you think about how freedom of speech works out in real life, it's not often isegoric. The boss brings you in and says, oh, I want everybody to give their ideas. There's no bad ideas. We're just brainstorming. And quickly, you realize that not everybody's ideas are welcome, and some people won't get a chance to talk. There's some cases where it doesn't make sense for everybody to talk. If you go to a rock concert, that is not an isegoric sort of thing, right? You're there to hear the band, and even though they ask you, how's everyone doing tonight? They're not going to hand the mic around and I'm doing pretty good. Oh, I just got off of work. You'd never have the concert, right? So there's some cases where we don't want that, but I think in a lot of cases, the way some people practice parrhesia, it makes it impossible for there to be isegoria. And if you think about the extended mouthpiece that a lot of people have because of how many followers they have, or how much money they have, or having political power, or being in a privileged class or something like that, they drown out a lot of other people's voices.
Mm-hmm. And so, it kind of reminds me, the agora, and where people would gather in Athens, was the marketplace, and they would also interact there. And I wonder if that is the root of why we call it the marketplace of ideas, as an etymological term.
Yeah, I don't know. That's actually a great question. I'm sure there is probably something out there specifically on that. I mean, I know that Socrates and Diogenes, the cynic, engaged in a lot of discussion with people in the marketplace, but I don't know that everybody in the marketplace was always happy to have them bothering them in the marketplace.
Well, they eventually killed Socrates, so I'd say you're onto something there for that.
Yeah, that's true.
What is the basis of virtue? I don't know. So,
well, he made people look bad, right? I mean, that's the story that's given about his older accusers. He asked them questions, so he's using his capacity to speak, and he's putting them on the spot, and then they get to talk, because Socrates will let you talk as much as you want to. Mm-hmm. It's just that what you say is going to look dumb after he's done with you, and people do not like that.
And then Diogenes the cynic would go around and, instead of engaging in conversation, would just blatantly violate the social norms, walking around naked and other things. Just to say, it's all of your stuff is a social convention, and why are you so uptight about that?
Yeah, he was somebody. I don't have a lot of sympathy for Diogenes myself. I don't know about you. I know that he's like a kind of a folk hero to a lot of people, but he just reminds me of so many nonconformists that I've known who are so deliberately nonconformists, and the cynics called themselves heralds of the god. They're supposed to be actually they had a higher calling. They're drawing people's attention to the virtue that they lack. But I think a lot of people that do that sort of stuff are just, they're playing around. And as a matter of fact, interestingly, in the ancient world, we see that the cynic school, they get made fun of a lot because apparently some of them were just doing that. They were just being kind of jerkish to be jerkish because they could, poke at people's things and criticize them and kind of get away with it.
It almost makes me think of those like idea of the hippie going around, or like that guy that maybe like took this first philosophy class and it's like, did I just blow your mind? And like saying things,
Yeah.
you know, the world is all an illusion, man. But getting back to our point here of isegoria and parrhesia, is then there was this like evolution of this, especially during the Enlightenment, and we've now have people along the lines of like Kant and Spinoza and Mill talking about the uniting of isegoria and logos or reason. So this is that equality of debate and reason into a kind of an idealized concept of free speech as freedom for reasoned speech and rational debate. So this is Kant, the freedom to make public use of one's reason was the fundamental and equal right of any human being or citizen, or I already quoted on Mill earlier, but defending the freedom of thought and discussion in the collectivist pursuit of truth, collective pursuit of truth.
Yeah, and I think that there was a sense that they had that most people at least would be carrying this sort of stuff out in good faith, genuinely trying to engage in discussion that was supposed to advance some values, right? Not just being mean to people or engaging in other things that indulge our worse parts. Mm-hmm. And I think that they were probably unrealistic in that assumption.
That these would result in actual honest debate, or what?
Yeah, I think that, well, they were wrong about that. And I also think that they didn't really grasp how easily debates could be taken over by all sorts of other things that allowed some people to have a big mouthpiece and other people just to get kind of pushed to the side. Mm-hmm. This was an ideal that they were espousing, and it gets used as an ideal. It gets abused as an ideal by people who are hiding behind it in order to say that they should be able to say whatever they want and they shouldn't have any consequences of other people not liking it or responding to them in kind.
So do you think the ideal itself is flawed, or just the usage of the ideal?
That's a good question. I think that the ideal, it's not that it's simply flawed, it's that it's inadequate. It's that it doesn't provide you with enough. You need to have, there's two sides to this. One is that you've got something kind of similar to the free rider problem, right? Mm-hmm. With any sort of public utility.
Tragedy of commons.
Yeah, and so you've got to find some way to deal with that. But I think in order to make it work, you also need to have some people who genuinely are trying to make the discourse better. And so this is where, again, I think it's useful to talk less about rights and more about responsibilities. And what is it to be a responsible person with your speech? And I think part of that is accepting responsibility for what you say. Socrates is a prime example there, right? He did, in fact, allow them to execute him, which involved him actually drinking the poison. I'm not saying
he had an out. He could have gone and lived at a friend's villa.
Yeah, exactly. Crito had bribed the guards and was like, "Hey, come on, let's get the hell out of here. They don't like you. They treated you unfairly." And Socrates was like, "Well, let's consider this." And by the end of it, he's not going anywhere. So that's part of it. I think you also, being responsible would mean taking responsibility for being well informed. Maybe there's a duty if you at least in certain discussions, like if you're going to talk about COVID-19, you need to have actually done some basic research, and research is not watching a single YouTube video or something like that. It's learning about what public health is, and also
maybe
making
have a little basic skepticism so you know how to actually find good information.
That's important too. What we call information literacy, And then I think not every debate needs to be hashed out at every time, so there's a prudence about what we're going to talk about at what time. There's some topics that we probably shouldn't talk about with certain people or with children. If we're going to treat things that are controversial. It's there's good ways to do that and there's bad ways to do that. There's ways that are going to create more conflict, and then there's ways that are going to try to create bridges. And then communicating with other people in good faith, that's really important. Mm-hmm. I think that's part of being a responsible, an honest interlocutor, not just trying to get something out of it yourself. What else do you think needs to go into that?
And just to, interlocutor, we said it several times, and I want to make sure that we define that term. And interlocutor is someone who is debating in good faith, that you're trying to honestly give your opinion and work out the truth of something. The idea is not to win the argument, but to come to a better understanding through argument.
Yeah.
And so, part of this is also you should, if you're going to actually engage in argument, you should have at least a passing understanding of what fallacious reasoning is and some of the basic ones. And if you know what fallacious reasoning is, it doesn't mean that you're bad or wrong for making these arguments, but that they are bad arguments. They're arguments, not bad arguments, but arguments that will not always result in true answers. And
they often lead us away from the truth, right? Is a way to put it.
And you can come to the right conclusion for wrong reasons, and the reason and why we want to have non-fallacious arguments is we want arguments that will always bring us to true answers if we argue them correctly. And also, it's not something that is bad about you if you happen to fall into these, that if someone calls you out on that argument, it's oh, I've now been given the ability to think and reason about this in a better way to find a better argument.
Yeah, that's where a lot of people have quite a hard time, right? Myself included, actually. I'll certainly cop to that. Nobody really likes to hear that you're wrong in the way that you've thought something out. But it does, if you can actually be open to it, then you can improve what you're thinking. And not just in terms of theoretical matters, but very practical matters. If you think that the way to interact with people is, here's a prime example. My dad used to tease us a lot when we were kids. And it was in part because he was kind of immature that way. I mean, he died when he was only 36. So obviously he didn't get much of a chance to develop. And he probably got that idea from his dad that that's the way to show love to people. It would drive us nuts. We didn't like it, but both of us kids, me and my sister, picked it up, and it took a long time to break out of that. And I found myself doing that even with my kids. And then people, and I wasn't the one who was oh, Greg, you're really doing the wrong thing. It was other people having to say, listen, dummy, you're doing the same thing that you say you don't like, right? Nobody likes to get called out on that sort of thing. But when it comes to communicating with other people, we do need to take the raw material that we are with its jagged edges and refine it a bit.
Mm-hmm. Once in the future, we'll all be nice rounded corners like all those iPhones.
Yeah. We'd all have to come out of some factory, probably, for that.
Or let's go to a nice rounded stone in the ocean that's a lot more organic.
True, yeah. But it takes a lot longer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
but,
if
good things are worth waiting for, right?
If you have motion sickness, that's not going to work for you, though.
So, what's our practice this week, Greg?
So we can just call it prudence in use of speech, and I think this is something that does come out of virtue ethics, but doesn't necessarily have to be tied to any particular school. So when you're tempted to wade into some discussion where you think that people are getting things wrong or using their freedom of speech wrongly, consider, just take a pause and consider, is this the place where I myself need to take a stand? Is this the right thing for me to do? Maybe it is. And if it is, well, then go ahead and do that. If you're the only person who can speak up for the person who's, say, being bullied, and you might actually not just speak up with them, you might talk to the people who are standing on the side and say, hey, aren't you going to do anything about this? This is wrong, not just confront the bully. If that's the case, then go ahead and do that. But in a lot of cases, I think we find that it's not. it's not the right time, or we don't have to be the one who's the defender of all values or whatever it is. And then what we can do, instead of just saying, okay, I'm going to withdraw from this and like go and eat chips and do nothing, we can deliberately use our capacity for speech productively elsewhere. If we really think that we need to be involved in standing up for something, there's plenty of things we can stand up for. We have all sorts of opportunities. Now that we have, we all live in the internet, you could just do a Google search and find something you could stand up for. If it's, the rights of animals, I'm sure there's plenty of places you could go to do that. If it's, saying that we should celebrate a particular holiday or not celebrate a particular holiday, there's places you can go for that. We could come up with endless examples. So that's the basic idea. It's an extension of the virtue of prudence, using the resources that we have rightly.
It comes immediately to mind like the Jains, in which at least the most devout of them will wear veils over their faces in order to make sure that they're not even inhaling small insects, because they have this incredible reverence for all living things, and will sweep the street in front of them. And some people only do this at like high holidays, but there are definitely Jain monks who will do this at a very almost constant level. And if you're going to go out and like protest and say everyone needs to do exactly what the Jains, the most devout Jains, are doing all the time, because I have this ideal of that anything that might be able to feel pain that or is alive has a fundamental right to life, and that that none of our actions should ever even accidentally harm them, then I don't think you're going to get a lot of people to actually buy onto your campaign.
No, that's a very tough one. The Jains are probably, that's one of the most difficult spiritual paths just in that extent to follow. And when you read, I used to teach about them when I taught world religion classes, and I read some Jain scriptures, and man, the stuff that the renunciants do is intense. But coming back to this, I mean, that's very far removed from where we are. There might be some point to people getting their feelings hurt some of the time. It could lead to useful confrontations, reconsiderations of their own position. I know I benefited quite a bit, even though I didn't realize it at the time, from people telling me that I was wrong and being a jerk. So, but it can be done in different ways. This is where we, again, come to the responsibility of speech. Just because we can say something doesn't mean that we automatically should say it, or we should say it in the way that we want to say it. We should probably think about the other person. And there's a lot of cases where perhaps even the people who are being jerks, we don't have to necessarily fight fire with fire, I
wonder, it seems like there could be a meeting in the middle somewhere. I don't know if it should be like 80-20 or something. But of like, there are certain things that I guess you can't control, and you can't control the other people's actions around you,
right,
and their speech. And so there's definitely things that are very rude and socially inappropriate. But there's also the things that are just kind of annoying, and that does not hit the same level of offense as other things. And so we should probably be aware of that and try to modulate to what is actually the things that are beyond the pale.
When we're calling things out, for example.
Yeah, or when someone is talking to you and saying like, "Oh, I didn't enjoy the way that you spoke to me."
Okay. Yeah, that makes good sense. Well, I see that we're just about at the end of our time. So
we've got the outgoing words that are commonly attributed to Mark Twain. Probably are much older in its original formation. But never argue with an idiot. He'll drag you down to his level, and he'll beat you with experience.